The moment I saw Patricia Henderson standing at my front door with her clipboard and designer sunglasses perched on her head like a crown, I knew my Tuesday was about to go sideways. I had just finished my morning coffee and was planning to tackle the mountain of work emails waiting for me in my home office. Instead, I found myself staring at the self-appointed queen of the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association, her lips pressed into that signature disapproving line I had come to know too well since moving to this suburban development outside Sacramento, California, 6 months ago. "Mr. Ethan Yardley," she asked, even though she knew exactly who I was. We had met at least a dozen times at various HOA meetings and neighborhood gatherings. "Patricia," I acknowledged, leaning against my doorframe. "What can I do for you?" She made a show of consulting her clipboard, flipping through several pages as if she needed to refresh her memory. "I'm here to inform you that you're in violation of Section 7.3 of the Meadowbrook Hills Community Guidelines regarding external utility equipment visibility." I blinked. "My what now?" "Your propane tank," she said, gesturing toward the side of my house where my standard residential propane tank sat behind some landscaping bushes. "It's visible from the street. That's a direct violation of our aesthetic guidelines." I turned to look at the tank she was referring to. The thing was maybe 30% visible if you stood at a specific angle on the sidewalk and really looked for it. The landscaping I had carefully planted actually did a pretty decent job of concealing it, but apparently not decent enough for Patricia's eagle eyes. "You're kidding me, right?" I said, turning back to her. "I can barely see it myself, and I know it's there." Patricia's expression hardened. "The guidelines are very clear, Mr. Yardley. All utility equipment, including but not limited to propane tanks, air conditioning units, and electrical boxes, must be completely screened from view of any public street or neighboring property." "Patricia, I've seen at least 4 other houses in this neighborhood with visible AC units and electrical boxes. Why are you singling out my propane tank?" She bristled at that. "Those situations are being addressed separately. Your case is what we're discussing right now. You have 14 days to remedy this violation, or you'll face a fine of $250 with an additional $100 per week until compliance is achieved." "This is insane," I said, running a hand through my hair. "I use that propane tank to heat my pool and run my backup generator. It's a standard residential installation. The company that installed it said this location was fine." "The installation company doesn't dictate HOA policy," Patricia said primly. "I don't make these rules, Mr. Yardley. I simply enforce them. 14 days. She turned on her heel and walked back down my driveway, her sensible pumps clicking against the concrete. I watched her climb into her white BMW SUV, still clutching that damned clipboard like it was the Holy Grail. I went back inside and immediately pulled up the HOA guidelines on my laptop. Sure enough, buried in the dense legalese of Section 7.3, there was indeed language about utility equipment visibility. But the wording was vague enough to be interpreted multiple ways. It said equipment should be reasonably screened from common view, which to me meant my bushes were doing exactly that. My phone rang. It was my neighbor, Marcus Chen, who lived 3 houses down. "Dude, I just saw Patricia leaving your place looking triumphant," he said. "What did you do to piss off the HOA queen this time? Apparently my propane tank is an eyesore that's destroying property values," I said dryly. Marcus laughed. "Let me guess, she threatened you with fines. $250 to start, then $100 a week after that. Classic Patricia." She did the same thing to the Johnsons about their trampoline last year. They ended up having to get rid of it even though their kids loved it. "Look, man, word of advice. Just comply. Fighting the HOA is like fighting City Hall. You'll lose, and it'll cost you more in the long run. After we hung up, I sat staring at my computer screen, feeling a familiar sense of frustration building in my chest. I had moved to Meadowbrook Hills specifically because it seemed like a nice, quiet community. The houses were well maintained, the streets were clean, and the amenities were decent. There was a community clubhouse with a gym, a pool, and meeting rooms that residents could use. I had even used the clubhouse once for a small family gathering. But I was quickly learning that life under an HOA meant living under constant scrutiny. Every little thing had to meet certain standards, and Patricia Henderson seemed to take particular pleasure in enforcing those standards with an iron fist. I decided to do some research. I spent the next few hours digging through HOA regulations, California property law, and various online forums where homeowners shared horror stories about their own HOA battles. What I found was both enlightening and depressing. Homeowners associations wielded enormous power, often more than people realized when they bought into these communities. They could fine you, place liens on your property, and even foreclose on your home in extreme cases. But they also had limitations. They had to follow their own bylaws, and they had to treat all homeowners fairly and consistently. That last part stuck with me. Fair and consistent enforcement. The next day, I took a walk around the neighborhood with my phone snapping photos. It didn't take long to document what I suspected. There were visible AC units on at least 6 properties. 3 houses had electrical boxes that were barely concealed at all. 2 homes had pool equipment that was in plain view. And the Robinsons on Maple Court had both a visible propane tank and an AC unit that you could see from the street. Armed with this evidence, I decided to attend the next HOA board meeting, which was scheduled for Thursday evening at the community clubhouse. Maybe I could appeal to reason and point out the inconsistent enforcement. I should have known better. The clubhouse meeting room was set up with a long table at the front where the 5 board members sat. Patricia was front and center as the HOA president. Flanking her were the vice president, Dale Murphy, a retired accountant with a permanent scowl, the secretary, Linda Foster, who seemed perpetually nervous, the treasurer, Robert Kim, who rarely spoke, and the member-at-large, Jennifer Walsh, who I'd heard was actually reasonable but seemed afraid to contradict Patricia. About 20 residents were scattered in the folding chairs facing the board. I recognized most of them from various neighborhood encounters. Patricia called the meeting to order at 7 sharp. They went through the usual agenda items, approving last month's minutes, reviewing the financial report, discussing upcoming landscaping projects for the common areas. Finally, they reached the open forum section where residents could raise concerns. I stood up. "Ethan Yardley, 428 Oakmont Drive," I said. "I want to discuss the violation notice I received regarding my propane tank." Patricia's expression didn't change. "That's not really a matter for open discussion, Mr. Yardley. Violation notices can be appealed in writing to the board within 7 days of receipt." "I understand that," I said calmly, "but I think there's a broader issue here about consistent enforcement of our community guidelines. I've documented multiple properties in this neighborhood with visible utility equipment. Why was my property singled out?" A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. I saw a couple people nodding. Patricia leaned forward. "As I told you at your home, other violations are being addressed through appropriate channels. Your violation was brought to our attention by a concerned neighbor, and we investigated and confirmed the issue. That's how the process works." "Can you tell me who filed the complaint?" I asked. "That information is confidential," Dale Murphy interjected. Residents have the right to report violations anonymously without fear of retaliation. Convenient, I muttered, but loud enough for people to hear. So someone can report their neighbor for any petty reason, and the board will investigate and fine based on that. But enforcement of the same rules across other properties is selective. Mr. Yardley, you're out of order, Patricia said sharply. If you want to appeal your violation, follow the proper procedure. This forum is not the place for you to argue your case. I'm not arguing my case, I said, my frustration starting to show. I'm questioning why our HOA board isn't consistently enforcing its own rules. Either everyone with visible utility equipment should be cited, or none of us should be. Selective enforcement is unfair and possibly discriminatory. That got Patricia's attention. Her cheeks flushed slightly. Are you accusing this board of discrimination, Mr. Yardley? I'm saying the enforcement appears inconsistent, and I'd like to understand why. Robert Kim cleared his throat. Perhaps we should review our enforcement procedures to ensure consistency, he said quietly. It was the first time I'd heard him speak at a meeting. Patricia shot him a look that could have melted steel. Our enforcement procedures are perfectly adequate, Robert. Mr. Yardley, you have your answer. Follow the appeal process if you wish to contest your violation. Next item. I sat down, my jaw clenched. Several neighbors gave me sympathetic looks, but no one else spoke up. After the meeting, Marcus found me in the parking lot. That took guts, he said, but you realize you just made an enemy of Patricia, right? She doesn't forget stuff like that. I'm already her enemy apparently, I said. Otherwise she wouldn't have gone after my propane tank in the first place. Fair point. Listen, if you need a witness or photos or whatever for your appeal, let me know. I've got your back. I thanked him and drove home, my mind racing. That night, I drafted a detailed appeal letter, including all my photos of other violations, arguments about inconsistent enforcement, and citations of California HOA law regarding fair treatment of homeowners. I submitted it through the HOA's online portal before midnight, making sure to save copies of everything. The next morning, I was reviewing the Clubhouse rental agreement for something unrelated when I noticed something interesting. Very interesting. The community clubhouse wasn't actually connected to the municipal gas line. It ran on propane, and according to the maintenance records I found in the publicly accessible HOA documents, that propane was supplied by the same company that had installed my residential tank. In fact, I had recommended that company to the HOA board last year when they were looking for a new supplier after issues with their previous vendor. More interesting still, the propane supply for the clubhouse came from my property. When this neighborhood was developed 8 years ago, my lot had been the first one sold and built on. The developer had installed a large commercial propane tank on my property to supply the clubhouse, which was being built at the same time. The arrangement was that the HOA would maintain an easement on my property for the tank and supply line, and in exchange, I received a substantial discount on my HOA dues. The previous owners of my house had agreed to this arrangement, and it had transferred to me when I bought the property. I pulled up the easement agreement and read through it carefully. The language was pretty standard for this type of arrangement, but one clause caught my attention. The easement was contingent on the HOA maintaining compliance with all applicable property agreements and treating the property owner fairly in accordance with HOA bylaws. I wasn't a lawyer, but it seemed to me that discriminatory or inconsistent enforcement of HOA rules might be considered a violation of the fair treatment requirement. I sat back in my chair, thinking. This was leverage, real leverage, but I needed to be smart about how I used it. First, I waited for the response to my appeal. It came exactly 7 days later, which was the maximum time allowed under the HOA bylaws. The answer was a form letter signed by Patricia and Dale, denying my appeal in its entirety. According to the letter, the board had reviewed my submission and determined that my violation was valid, that enforcement was being handled appropriately across the community, and that my fine would stand. I had 7 days to come into compliance or face the $250 initial fine. The letter made no mention of the specific examples I'd provided of other violations. No explanation of why those weren't being addressed. Nothing. I called the propane company, Western States Propane, and asked to speak with the regional manager. After some phone tag, I got connected to a guy named Steve Michaels. "Steve, this is Ethan Yardley in Meadowbrook Hills," I said. "I need to understand the service agreement for the commercial tank on my property that supplies the community clubhouse." "Sure, let me pull that up," Steve said. I heard keyboard clicking. "Okay, got it. What's your question?" "Who owns that tank?" "You do, actually. Or rather, the property owner does. It's on your property, and according to our records, it was included in the property transfer when you bought the house. The HOA pays for the propane supply and maintenance through us, but the tank itself belongs to the property owner. And if I wanted to, could I restrict access to that tank?" There was a pause. "Well, that's a tricky question. There's an easement that allows the HOA to maintain the supply line across your property. But if you own the tank itself, then technically, yes, you could deny access. Though I'd strongly recommend you consult with a lawyer before doing anything like that. Easement law can get complicated, and you don't want to end up in legal trouble. What if the easement was being violated by the other party?" Another pause. "Then you'd need to consult with a lawyer about your options." "Look, Mr. Yardley, I'm just the propane guy. I make sure people have gas for their appliances and heaters. Whatever legal issues you're dealing with, that's above my pay grade." "I understand. One more question. If I wanted to shut off supply to the clubhouse, how would I do that?" "There's a main shut-off valve at the tank. Just turn it 90 degrees. But again, I really don't think you should do that without talking to a lawyer first. You could be creating a huge liability for yourself." I thanked him and hung up. Then I called David Romano, a real estate attorney I'd worked with when buying my house. David listened to my whole story, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "This is a messy situation, Ethan," he said finally. "On one hand, you have a legitimate grievance about inconsistent enforcement. On the other hand, taking action against the easement could open you up to a lawsuit from the HOA. Let me review the documents you mentioned and get back to you with a proper legal opinion." I emailed him everything. The easement agreement, my appeal and the denial, the photos of other violations, the HOA bylaws and the violation notice. He promised to review it within a couple days. In the meantime, I did nothing about the propane tank visibility issue. The deadline came and went. Sure enough, 3 days after the deadline, I received another letter. This one informed me that I was being fined $250, with an additional $100 weekly fine until I came into compliance. The fine would be added to my HOA dues and, if unpaid, could result in a lien against my property. Patricia had also apparently decided to escalate her campaign. I came home from a grocery run to find a bright orange violation sticker plastered on my garage door. It detailed my violation and the fines in bold letters, visible to anyone who drove by. It was humiliating and, I suspected, not actually allowed under HOA procedures, but it certainly sent a message. David called me that evening. "I've reviewed everything," he said. Here's the situation. The easement agreement does include language about fair treatment in accordance with HOA bylaws. The inconsistent enforcement you've documented could potentially be considered a violation of that requirement, especially since you can prove other similar violations aren't being addressed. However, trying to revoke or interfere with the easement would likely result in the HOA suing you for breach of contract and potentially seeking damages. What if I don't revoke the easement, but simply exercise my rights as the tank owner? Explain what you mean. The tank is on my property. I own it. The easement gives them the right to run the supply line across my land, but it doesn't explicitly give them ownership of the tank itself. What if I needed to perform maintenance on the tank, or had a safety concern that required shutting off the supply temporarily? David was quiet for a long moment. That's creative, and possibly viable depending on how it's framed. If you had a legitimate reason to shut off the supply that was related to safety or maintenance and it was temporary, you might be within your rights. But Ethan, I need to be clear with you. This is a risky play. The HOA will almost certainly sue you, and you'll end up spending thousands in legal fees even if you win. What if I don't shut it off, but simply threaten to? Use it as leverage to get them to back off the violation and the fines. That's extortion, technically. I can't advise you to do that. What I can say is that you have grounds to file your own lawsuit against the HOA for discriminatory enforcement, which might get their attention. But litigation is expensive and time-consuming. We talked through various options for another 30 minutes. By the end of the call, I was frustrated and angry. It seemed like the HOA could do whatever it wanted, but homeowners had limited recourse other than expensive legal action. That weekend, I noticed increased activity at the clubhouse. There was a sign advertising a community event on Saturday afternoon, something about a welcome party for new residents. I decided to take a walk over there, just to see what was going on. The clubhouse was bustling. There were probably 50 people there, families with kids, couples, elderly residents. Tables were set up with food and drinks. Patricia was holding court near the entrance, greeting people with her practiced smile. I walked around the building, ostensibly checking out the facilities but really looking at the propane setup. The supply line ran underground from my property, about 200 yards away, and connected to the clubhouse's heating system and the commercial kitchen inside. The main shutoff valve Steve had mentioned was on the tank itself, back on my property. As I was standing there, Jennifer Walsh, the member-at-large from the HOA board, approached me. "Ethan, hi," she said, sounding a bit nervous. "I'm glad you came. Are you settling in okay despite, well, everything?" "Depends on your definition of okay," I said. "I'm being fined for something that other people aren't being fined for, and the board seems determined to make an example of me for reasons I don't understand." Jennifer looked around to make sure no one was listening. "Look, between you and me, I think Patricia is being unreasonable about your situation. I tried to bring it up at the last board meeting, but she shut me down. She's very protective of her authority, and when you challenged her at the open forum, it became personal for her. So this is retaliation." "I didn't say that," Jennifer said quickly. "But Patricia takes HOA violations very seriously, and she doesn't like being questioned. My advice: just fix the issue, pay the fine, and move on. Fighting her will only make things worse." That seems like a pretty corrupt way to run an HOA. It's not corrupt, it's just politics. Every organization has power dynamics. Patricia has been president for 6 years. She knows how things work, and she's got Dale firmly in her corner. Robert and Linda usually just go along with whatever she wants. I try to push back when I can, but I'm outvoted most of the time. After Jennifer left, I walked back home, my mind made up. I was done playing by rules that only seemed to apply to me. Monday morning, I called Western States Propane again. "Steve, it's Ethan Yardley. I need to schedule a maintenance inspection on the commercial tank on my property." "Sure. When were you thinking?" "Today, if possible. And I'll need you to shut off the supply while you're doing the inspection. Safety precaution." Okay. Let me check the schedule. I can have a tech out there around 2 this afternoon. But heads up, shutting off the supply will affect the clubhouse. They won't have heat or hot water until we turn it back on. I understand. Let's do it. How long do you want the supply shut off? Let's say a week. I want a thorough inspection. Steve hesitated. A week? That's a long time for an inspection. Usually these take a few hours at most. I have concerns about potential leaks and safety issues. I want it done right. If the inspection shows everything is fine, we can turn it back on sooner. Your call, Mr. Yardley, but the HOA isn't going to be happy about this. Send me an invoice for the inspection. I'll pay it myself. At 2:15, a Western States Propane truck pulled up. A technician named Carlos got out, carrying a clipboard and some equipment. I met him at the tank. "Mr. Michaels said you want a maintenance inspection," Carlos asked. "That's right. Full inspection, check for any potential leaks or safety issues. And I'll need you to shut off the supply to the clubhouse while you're working." Carlos shrugged. "You're the boss. Let me take a look." He spent about 30 minutes checking the tank, the connections, and the supply line. Finally, he straightened up. "Everything looks good, Mr. Yardley. No leaks, no corrosion, pressure is fine. This is a well-maintained system." "Great. Go ahead and shut it off anyway. I want to monitor it for a few days to make sure there are no issues before we turn it back on." Carlos gave me a skeptical look but didn't argue. He turned the main shutoff valve 90 degrees, cutting off the propane supply to the clubhouse. Then he filled out some paperwork and had me sign it. "You're going to need to call us when you want it turned back on," he said. "Don't try to do it yourself. These commercial systems need to be restarted by a professional." I assured him I would, and he left. I went back inside my house and waited. It took exactly 47 minutes. That's how long it took for my phone to start ringing. The first call was from an unknown number which I ignored. Then Patricia called. I let it go to voicemail. She called again. Voicemail. Text messages started coming in. "Mr. Yardley, this is Patricia Henderson. We have an emergency at the clubhouse. The propane supply has been shut off. If you know anything about this, please call me immediately." I waited until the next morning to respond. I sent a polite email to the entire HOA board, copying the general HOA email address so it would be part of the official record. "Dear board members, I wanted to inform you that I have scheduled routine maintenance on the propane tank located on my property. As a safety precaution, the supply has been temporarily shut off while I address some concerns about potential leaks and system integrity. I expect this to take approximately 1 week, possibly longer depending on what the inspection reveals. I apologize for any inconvenience this may cause. Best regards, Ethan Yardley." My phone rang within 5 minutes. "Patricia." "Mr. Yardley, what the hell do you think you're doing?" She was furious, her voice shaking. "I'm performing necessary maintenance on equipment that I own, located on my property," I said calmly. "The propane company confirmed that as the property owner, the tank belongs to me. I have both the right and the responsibility to ensure it's safe. You can't just shut off the clubhouse supply. We have events scheduled. The building needs heat. I'm sorry about the timing, Patricia, but safety has to come first. I'm sure you understand. This is retaliation for your violation fine. Don't think I don't see what you're doing." "I have no idea what you mean. This is simply routine maintenance. In fact, I'm surprised the HOA hasn't been more proactive about inspecting this equipment. It's been at least 3 years since the last documented inspection. Turn it back on right now, or I'll have the HOA's lawyer contact you. You're welcome to do that, but I'd recommend you have them review the tank ownership documents and the easement agreement first, specifically the section about fair treatment of property owners. I'll be happy to discuss this with your attorney. Patricia hung up on me. 10 minutes later, I got an email from Dale Murphy, threatening immediate legal action if I didn't restore the propane supply. I responded with another polite email, reiterating my safety concerns and my rights as the property owner, and suggesting that the board's attorney review the relevant documents before proceeding. By late afternoon, the situation had escalated significantly. I had received multiple calls and emails from board members, as well as several angry messages from residents who had events planned at the clubhouse. Someone had apparently told people that I was the one who'd shut off the propane, and neighborhood opinion was turning against me. Marcus called me that evening. "Dude, what did you do? Everyone's talking about how you sabotaged the clubhouse." "I didn't sabotage anything. I'm performing maintenance on my property." "Come on, man. The timing is pretty suspicious, right after your violation fine." "Is it?" "Because I think the suspicious timing is the HOA targeting me with selective enforcement of their rules, and then retaliating when I dared to question it." Marcus sighed. "Look, I get it, but you're making yourself the villain here. People don't care about the nuances of HOA politics. They just know they can't use the clubhouse, and you're the reason why. Then maybe they should ask the HOA board why they're so intent on fining me for something they don't fine anyone else for." After we hung up, I admit I felt a twinge of doubt. Maybe I was going too far. Maybe I should just pay the fine, screen the propane tank better, and move on with my life. But then I looked at the orange sticker still on my garage door, broadcasting my violation to the entire neighborhood, and my resolve hardened. Patricia had made this personal. She had singled me out, ignored my legitimate concerns about inconsistent enforcement, and publicly humiliated me with that sticker. If she wanted to play hardball, I could play too. The next day, I received a letter from the HOA's attorney, a firm called Morrison and Associates based in downtown Sacramento. The letter demanded that I immediately restore the propane supply to the clubhouse, warned that I was in breach of the easement agreement, and threatened litigation if I didn't comply within 24 hours. I forwarded the letter to David Romano. He called me an hour later. "They're bluffing," he said. "Or at least, they're overplaying their hand. The easement agreement doesn't give them control over the tank itself, only the right to maintain the supply line. You have a legitimate property right to inspect and maintain equipment on your own land. That said, if you drag this out for weeks, they'll probably have a case that you're interfering with the easement in bad faith. What if I offered to turn it back on in exchange for them dropping the violation fine and the enforcement action? That could work. Frame it as a good faith resolution. But get it in writing before you turn anything back on." I drafted a carefully worded email to the HOA board, offering to expedite the maintenance inspection and restore propane supply within 48 hours, provided that the board agreed to rescind my violation notice and fine, and commit to a comprehensive review of utility equipment visibility throughout the neighborhood to ensure consistent enforcement going forward. Patricia's response came within an hour. "Absolutely not. Your extortion attempt has been noted and will be included in our legal filing. Restore the supply immediately or face the consequences." So much for negotiation. That evening, there was an emergency HOA board meeting. It was posted on the community website with only 3 hours' notice, which I was pretty sure violated the bylaws regarding meeting notifications. But I decided to attend anyway. The clubhouse meeting room was packed. Probably 60 people were there, way more than usual. The room was cold because, of course, there was no heat. People were wearing coats and looking unhappy. Patricia called the meeting to order, her expression grim. "Thank you all for coming on short notice. We're here to discuss the current crisis affecting our community clubhouse. As many of you know, the propane supply has been deliberately shut off by one of our residents in an act of retaliation against a legitimate HOA violation enforcement action." Several people turned to look at me. I kept my expression neutral. "This is unacceptable," Patricia continued. "Our community facilities are for everyone's benefit, and one person's vendetta cannot be allowed to hold the entire neighborhood hostage. The board has consulted with our attorney and will be filing a lawsuit against Ethan Yardley tomorrow morning seeking immediate injunctive relief to restore the propane supply, as well as damages for breach of contract." Dale Murphy chimed in. "We also want the community to understand that Mr. Yardley's actions are a direct result of his refusal to comply with basic community standards. He was cited for a clear violation of our aesthetic guidelines and chose to respond with this sabotage rather than simply screening his propane tank from view like a reasonable person would do." I stood up. "Can I respond to these accusations?" "This isn't a trial, Mr. Yardley," Patricia snapped. "You'll have your chance to explain yourself in court. Actually, according to HOA bylaws, any member has the right to speak during the open forum portion of any meeting," I said. "And since you didn't list an agenda for this emergency meeting, I think everything qualifies as open forum." Jennifer Walsh nodded. "He's right, Patricia. Let him speak." Patricia looked like she wanted to argue, but several other residents were nodding in agreement. She made a gesture of exasperation. "Fine. 2 minutes. I address the room, not the board. Here's what actually happened. 6 weeks ago, Patricia came to my house and cited me for having a partially visible propane tank. She threatened me with substantial fines if I didn't fix it within 2 weeks. I looked around the neighborhood and found at least 10 other properties with visible utility equipment, none of which have been cited. I appealed the violation, providing photo evidence of the inconsistent enforcement. My appeal was denied without any substantive response to the evidence I provided. I paused, looking around the room. People were listening. I was fined $250 with ongoing weekly fines until I comply. The HOA board also placed an orange violation sticker on my garage door, publicly humiliating me. When I consulted with an attorney about my options, I learned that I own the propane tank that supplies this clubhouse. It's on my property, and I have a legal right and responsibility to maintain it. So I scheduled a maintenance inspection. The propane company found no issues, but I wanted to monitor the system for a few days to ensure there were no intermittent leaks or pressure problems. "That's a lie," Patricia shouted. "You're doing this to get revenge for a legitimate violation citation. If it's so legitimate, why aren't you citing the other 10 properties with the same issue?" I shot back. "Why am I the only one being fined? And why did you refuse to even address that question in my appeal?" Several people started talking at once. Marcus stood up. "Actually, I've noticed the same thing Ethan is talking about. The Robinsons have a visible propane tank too, and I've never seen a violation sticker on their garage." Another resident, a woman I didn't know well, spoke up. "We have an AC unit that's visible from the street. Should we expect to be fined too?" The meeting devolved into chaos. Multiple residents were asking questions about enforcement policies. Patricia was trying to regain control, banging her gavel and calling for order. Dale was red-faced and arguing with someone in the front row. Only Jennifer and Robert looked uncomfortable, like they wanted to be anywhere else. Finally, Jennifer stood up. "I think we need to take a step back here. Patricia, I've been saying for months that we need clearer guidelines on enforcement. If residents feel like rules are being applied inconsistently, that's a problem for the whole board, not just Ethan." "The rules are perfectly clear," Patricia insisted, "and they're applied consistently. Mr. Yardley's violation was reported by a concerned neighbor, and we investigated." "That's the process. But why aren't you investigating all the other violations?" Marcus called out. "Ethan showed photos of like a dozen other properties. Did you look at those?" Patricia's face was flushed. "Other violations are addressed as they're reported. We can't inspect every single property constantly. We rely on residents to report issues. So if I report all those other violations tomorrow, will you cite them too?" I asked. "That's not the point." Patricia was losing her composure now. "The point is that you're holding our community facilities hostage because you don't want to follow the rules." "I'm not holding anything hostage," I said firmly. "I'm exercising my property rights while dealing with what I believe is discriminatory enforcement by this board. If you want the propane turned back on, drop the violation and the fines, and commit to fair enforcement going forward. That's all I'm asking for." "We will not negotiate with extortion," Dale said. "It's not extortion to assert my property rights," I replied. "Your attorney's letter doesn't change the fact that I own that tank. If you want to sue me, go ahead. But I suspect a judge will be very interested in the inconsistent enforcement issue, especially when I show up with documentation of all the other violations you've ignored." The meeting broke up with no resolution. People left angry and confused. I got a mix of reactions, some supportive, others hostile. One elderly man told me I was being childish. A young couple thanked me for standing up to the board. That night I lay in bed wondering if I'd made a huge mistake. Legal fees could run into the tens of thousands. Even if I won, would it be worth it? But every time I thought about backing down, I remembered Patricia's smug expression when she'd threatened me with fines, and the humiliating orange sticker on my garage. The lawsuit came the next day, delivered by a process server who showed up at my door at 8 in the morning. The HOA was seeking an emergency temporary restraining order to force me to restore the propane supply, plus damages and attorney fees. David Romano reviewed the filing and told me we needed to respond within 5 days to prevent a default judgment. He prepared our response, arguing that I had legitimate property rights, that the maintenance inspection was valid, and that the HOA's selective enforcement of its own rules violated the terms of the easement agreement. The hearing for the temporary restraining order was scheduled for the following Wednesday, just 6 days away. In the meantime, the clubhouse remained without propane. The HOA had to rent portable heaters for an event that weekend, which apparently cost them several $100s. I spent those 6 days documenting everything. I drove around the entire neighborhood, photographing every visible utility installation I could find. I compiled the HOA bylaws, the easement agreement, and the community guidelines. I gathered my correspondence with the board, including the violation notice, my appeal, and their denial. David helped me organize everything into a coherent presentation. The hearing was held at the Sacramento County Superior Court. It was surreal walking into a courtroom over an HOA dispute, but there we were. The HOA was represented by Gerald Morrison himself, the senior partner from Morrison and Associates. He was probably in his 60s, silver-haired and expensive-looking, Judge Margaret Sullivan presided. She was a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor. After the preliminaries, Morrison presented the HOA's case. Your Honor, this is a straightforward matter. The defendant has deliberately interfered with an easement agreement, shutting off propane supply to community facilities used by hundreds of residents. His stated reason, that he's conducting maintenance, is a transparent pretext. The propane company's own inspection found no issues. The defendant is clearly acting in retaliation for receiving a violation citation from the HOA, and his actions are causing significant harm to the community. We ask that you order him to immediately restore the supply and hold him liable for damages. Judge Sullivan turned to David. Counsel. David stood. Your Honor, Mr. Yardley is not interfering with the easement. The easement grants the HOA the right to maintain a supply line across his property. It does not grant them ownership or control of the propane tank itself, which belongs to Mr. Yardley as the property owner. He has an absolute right to inspect and maintain equipment on his own property, and he's done so in good faith. The inspection found no problems, Morrison interjected. The initial inspection found no obvious problems, David corrected. But Mr. Yardley is rightfully concerned about potential safety issues. These concerns are particularly reasonable given that he's also being subjected to what appears to be discriminatory enforcement of HOA rules. He handed a binder to the judge. Your Honor, we've documented at least 15 other properties in the same community with visible utility equipment, identical to or worse than Mr. Yardley's situation. None of those properties have been cited or fined. Only Mr. Yardley has been singled out, and this happened shortly after he questioned the HOA president's authority at a public meeting. Judge Sullivan spent several minutes reviewing the binder, looking at the photos and documents. Morrison tried to object, arguing that the enforcement issue was irrelevant to the easement question, but the judge waved him off. I'm going to allow it. If Mr. Yardley is claiming the HOA violated the fair treatment provisions of the easement agreement, that's relevant to whether he's justified in taking action regarding the tank. Morrison looked frustrated. Your Honor, even if there are enforcement inconsistencies, and I'm not conceding that there are, the proper remedy is to file a complaint with the HOA or pursue arbitration. The defendant can't take unilateral action that harms the entire community. What would you have him do? David asked. He did file a formal appeal with the HOA. It was denied without substantive response to his evidence. He's being fined hundreds of dollars for something that other homeowners aren't being fined for. The HOA also posted a violation sticker on his property in public view, which appears to violate their own procedures regarding confidentiality of enforcement actions. This was news to me. I glanced at David, who gave me a subtle nod. Judge Sullivan leaned back in her chair. Mr. Morrison, I'm troubled by what I'm seeing here. Your client appears to have engaged in inconsistent enforcement of its own rules, possibly as retaliation against a homeowner who dared to question the board's authority. Now you want me to grant emergency relief to benefit that same HOA board while they continue to fine your opponent. I'm not inclined to do that. Your Honor, Morrison said, his tone becoming more deferential. Perhaps we can resolve this matter without the court's intervention. If the parties could have a brief recess to discuss settlement, Judge Sullivan looked at David, who looked at me. I nodded. 30 minutes, the judge said. Conference room B is available. Let's see if you can work this out. We all relocated to a small conference room down the hall. Morrison was there with Patricia and Dale. The atmosphere was tense. Here's what the HOA is willing to offer, Morrison began. We'll reduce your fine from $250 to $100 as a good faith gesture. You restore the propane supply today, and we all move on." "No," I said flatly. "Complete dismissal of the violation and all fines. Written policy from the board committing to consistent enforcement across all properties. And removal of the violation sticker from my property with an apology for the public humiliation." Patricia actually laughed. "You can't be serious. You're the one who's going to apologize after what you've put this community through." "Your Honor seemed pretty troubled by your inconsistent enforcement," David observed. "If we go back in there, I'm going to put Mrs. Henderson on the stand and ask her under oath why my client was singled out. I'm going to present evidence of all the other violations that haven't been addressed. And I'm going to argue that the HOA violated its own bylaws and the easement agreement, which gives Mr. Yardley grounds to restrict access to his property." Morrison held up a hand. "Let's everyone take a breath. Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Murphy, could you give me a moment alone with the other side?" Patricia looked like she wanted to argue, but Morrison's expression was firm. She and Dale left the room. Morrison turned to us. "Off the record, my clients have a weak case and they know it, or at least I've told them they have a weak case. The problem is that Mrs. Henderson is very invested in her authority as HOA president, and she sees this as a personal challenge. But I've reviewed your evidence, and you're right that the enforcement has been inconsistent at best." "So, what are you proposing?" David asked. "Dismissal of the violation and fines." "The sticker comes off today. The HOA commits to a review of all visible utility equipment in the community and will develop clear, objective standards for enforcement going forward. In exchange, you restore the propane supply today and agree not to interfere with it again barring actual safety concerns. And if they come after my client again with retaliatory enforcement," David asked. Morrison sighed. "I'll be recommending to the board that Mrs. Henderson step down as president. I can't force that to happen, but between you and me, this situation has revealed some serious governance issues. The board needs fresh leadership." I looked at David. He nodded slightly. It was a good deal, probably better than we'd get from the judge. "One more thing," I said. "The orange sticker doesn't just come off. Patricia Henderson personally removes it and apologizes to me in front of my house, in view of anyone who wants to watch. She made a public spectacle of my violation. She can make a public spectacle of admitting she was wrong." Morrison winced. "She's not going to like that. She doesn't have to like it, but that's the deal." Morrison left to consult with his clients. We could hear raised voices from down the hall. 10 minutes later, he came back looking tired. "She's agreed. But the apology will be brief and professional. No groveling. Fine by me." We drafted a settlement agreement right there in the conference room. Everyone signed it, and Morrison took it to Judge Sullivan to have it entered as a court order, making it enforceable. That afternoon, I called Western States Propane and scheduled the supply restoration for the next morning. Then I went home and waited. At 4 o'clock, Patricia's white BMW pulled up to my house. Morrison was with her, probably to make sure she actually went through with it. Several neighbors had somehow gotten word of what was happening, including Marcus, and they were standing on the sidewalk watching. Patricia walked up to my garage door, carefully peeled off the orange violation sticker and crumpled it up. Then she turned to me. "Mr. Yardley, I apologize for the manner in which your violation was handled. The board will be reviewing its enforcement procedures to ensure consistency going forward." Her voice was stiff and formal, but she got the words out. "Thank you, Patricia," I said. "I appreciate you acknowledging the issue." She turned and walked back to her car without another word. Morrison gave me a brief nod before following her. Marcus came over, grinning. "Dude, that was epic. I can't believe you actually made her apologize." "I didn't want to make her do anything," I said. "I just wanted to be treated fairly." "Well, you definitely got everyone's attention. The neighborhood group chat has been going crazy for the past week." The propane supply was restored the next morning. The clubhouse was back in business by that afternoon. I got a few thank you messages from residents who'd had events planned, and a few dirty looks from others who thought I'd gone too far. But the settlement had a bigger impact than I expected. Within 2 weeks, the HOA board announced a comprehensive review of all community guidelines and enforcement procedures. They hired an outside management company to audit the neighborhood and identify any existing violations, with the goal of bringing everyone into compliance through a fair and transparent process. They also announced that Patricia Henderson had decided not to seek re-election as HOA president. The official statement said she wanted to spend more time with her family, but everyone knew the real reason. Dale Murphy also stepped down as vice president. The next election brought in a slate of new board members, including Jennifer Walsh as the new president. Jennifer's first major initiative was to update the community guidelines with clearer, more objective standards for things like utility equipment visibility. The new rule required equipment to be substantially screened, defined as at least 75% concealed from public view at a distance of 25 feet. It was specific enough to be enforceable but reasonable enough that most people could comply without major expense. The new board also implemented a policy requiring any violation citations to be reviewed by at least 3 board members before being issued, to prevent single individuals from wielding too much power. As for my propane tank, I added some additional landscaping that brought it into compliance with the new standards. It cost me about $200 and an afternoon of planting, which seemed reasonable. About 6 months after everything settled down, I was at the clubhouse for a neighborhood barbecue. Jennifer came over to chat. "You know, I never thanked you properly for what you did," she said. That whole situation was a mess, but it forced the board to address problems that had been building for years. Patricia had gotten way too comfortable wielding power without accountability. "I wasn't trying to stage a coup," I said. "I just didn't want to be singled out unfairly." "I know. But sometimes it takes someone willing to push back to create real change." The new board is functioning much better. We actually discuss things and make decisions together instead of just rubber stamping whatever Patricia wanted. What happened to Patricia anyway? I haven't seen her around much. Jennifer lowered her voice. "She and her husband put their house on the market. I heard they're moving to Arizona, probably for the best. She couldn't handle not being in charge anymore." I felt a twinge of guilt at that. I hadn't set out to drive anyone from their home. But then, I remembered the orange sticker on my garage, the dismissive way she'd treated my concerns, and the expensive legal battle she'd forced by refusing to acknowledge her own inconsistent enforcement. Sometimes people create their own consequences. Marcus joined us, carrying a plate loaded with burgers and potato salad. "Did you guys hear about the new proposal to renovate the clubhouse kitchen?" We spent the next hour talking about neighborhood matters, just 3 residents trying to make their community better. It felt good. It felt normal. Later that evening, as I was walking home, I passed the spot where the underground propane line ran from my property to the clubhouse. You couldn't see any evidence of it from the surface, but I knew it was there. The easement was still in place, the supply was flowing, and the clubhouse was serving its purpose for the community. But now everyone knew that property rights went both ways. The HOA had authority granted by the homeowners, But that authority came with responsibilities, fair treatment, consistent enforcement, accountability. I had learned something too. Sometimes the only way to fight an unjust system is to understand the rules better than the people trying to use them against you. The easement agreement, the tank ownership, the bylaws about board procedures had all been tools available to me. I just had to be willing to use them. Was it risky? Absolutely. I'd gambled that the legal system would see the HOA's inconsistent enforcement for what it was, and that gamble had paid off. But it could have easily gone the other way. I could have been hit with a massive judgment and legal fees that would have taken years to pay off. The key had been documentation, photos of other violations, written appeals and responses, maintenance records, the easement agreement itself. When it came down to it in that courthouse, facts mattered more than emotions or authority. As I reached my front door, I glanced at the side yard where my propane tank sat, now nicely screened by mature landscaping. You could barely see it at all. It looked good, actually. Maybe Patricia had been right that it needed better screening, but that wasn't the point. The point was that everyone should be held to the same standard, enforced in the same way. Rules without fairness are just tools for bullies. My phone buzzed with a text from David Romano. Saw the board election results. Looks like your revolution succeeded. Drink sometime to celebrate. I smiled and texted back. Sure, but I'm paying. That legal bill was brutal. Worth it though, right? I thought about that for a moment before responding. Yeah, it was worth it, and it was. Not because I'd won or because Patricia had been forced out. It was worth it because the HOA was actually functioning better now. The board was more transparent, the rules were clearer, and homeowners felt like they had a voice. Sometimes change requires conflict. Sometimes the only way to fix a broken system is to break it a little more first, exposing the cracks so they can be properly repaired. I went inside, poured myself a beer, and sat down in my living room. Through the window, I could see lights on in houses up and down the street. Families having dinner, kids doing homework, people living their lives in this little community we all shared. We had rules to maintain property values and neighborhood standards, and those rules served a purpose. But they had to be applied fairly, or they became weapons instead of tools. I raised my beer in a silent toast to fair treatment, property rights, and the power of homeowners who refuse to be pushed around. Then I drank, and it tasted like victory. The next morning, I woke up to an email from the new HOA board. It was a community newsletter, something they'd started putting out monthly. This one featured a message from Jennifer about the importance of community engagement and treating all residents with respect. There was also a reminder about the revised community guidelines and information about upcoming events at the clubhouse. At the bottom was a small note. Special thanks to all residents who participated in the recent policy review process. Your input helped create fairer and more transparent governance for our community. I didn't need a special mention. I'd gotten what I wanted, fair treatment and a better functioning HOA. That was enough. I got dressed and headed outside for my morning run. As I jogged past the clubhouse, I saw the lights were on inside. Someone was using the gym. The facility was serving its purpose, powered by propane flowing from the tank on my property through an easement we all respected. It was exactly how things should work. Mutual obligations, mutual respect, and rules applied fairly to everyone. My conflict with the HOA had taught me something important about community living. It's not enough to just follow the rules and hope for the best. Sometimes you have to stand up and demand accountability from those in power. Sometimes you have to risk conflict to create positive change. but it also taught me about choosing battles wisely. If I'd been wrong about the inconsistent enforcement, if Patricia had been citing everyone equally, and I was just the latest in a long line of violators, then my stand would have been pointless and costly. The key was having evidence, understanding my rights, and being willing to see it through. As I rounded the corner back toward my house, I saw a new family moving into the property 3 doors down. A young couple with 2 small kids were directing a moving truck. I decided to stop and introduce myself. "Welcome to the neighborhood," I said, shaking hands with the husband, who introduced himself as Tom. "Thanks," he said. "We're excited to be here. The HOA president actually came by yesterday to welcome us and go over the community guidelines. She seemed really nice." "Jennifer's great," I agreed. "If you ever have questions or concerns about HOA stuff, she's very approachable." "That's good to know. Our last neighborhood didn't even have an HOA, so this is all new to us. Just read the guidelines carefully and follow them consistently. And if you ever feel like you're being treated unfairly, don't be afraid to speak up. The board is much more responsive than it used to be." Tom looked curious about that comment, but I didn't elaborate. He'd hear the stories eventually. Every neighborhood has its history. I finished my run and spent the rest of the day working from home, dealing with the usual conference calls and emails that filled my weekdays. Life had returned to normal, or at least as normal as it gets when you work in tech sales and live in a managed community. That evening, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "Mr. Yardley, this is Sarah Pemberton from Cover News. I'm doing a story about HOA conflicts in Sacramento area neighborhoods, and your name came up in connection with a recent dispute. Would you be willing to talk with me?" A news story. That's all I needed. "I don't think so," I said. "That situation is resolved and I'd rather leave it in the past." "I understand, but I think your experience could help other homeowners who are dealing with similar issues. HOA overreach is becoming a real problem in California, and personal stories like yours can shine a light on these issues." I thought about it. Part of me wanted to stay out of the spotlight, to just enjoy my newly peaceful existence. But another part of me remembered how isolated I'd felt when Patricia was threatening me with fines, and I didn't know what my options were. If my story could help someone else in that situation, maybe it was worth telling. "Let me think about it," I told Sarah. "Can I call you back in a day or two?" She gave me her number and I hung up. That night I talked it over with my brother on the phone. He lived in Florida in a neighborhood without an HOA, and he'd been following my saga with bemused interest. "Do it," he said. "You stood up to bullies and won. That's a story worth sharing. Plus, it might make other HOA boards think twice before pulling the same crap on someone else. Or it might just make me look like the guy who shut off heat to a community building over a petty dispute." Was it petty? They were fining you for something they weren't fining anyone else for. "That's not petty, that's discrimination. Tell your story." In the end, I called Sarah back and agreed to a brief interview. We met at a coffee shop in Roseville, and I walked her through the whole situation from start to finish. She recorded everything and took notes. "This is exactly the kind of story I'm looking for," she said when I finished. "It shows how HOAs can abuse their power, but also how homeowners can fight back if they know their rights. Just make sure you're fair to both sides," I said. "The old board made mistakes, but the new board is actually doing a good job. I don't want this to become a hit piece on HOAs in general." "Absolutely. Balance is important." The story ran 2 weeks later as part of a larger segment on HOA conflicts. They interviewed me, showed photos of the violation sticker on my garage, and explained the propane tank situation. They also interviewed Jennifer Walsh, who talked about the reforms the new board had implemented. Morrison declined to be interviewed, and Patricia couldn't be reached for comment. The response was significant. The station received dozens of emails from viewers sharing their own HOA horror stories. Several homeowners reached out to me directly through Facebook, asking for advice on their situations. I found myself becoming an accidental advocate for HOA reform. A local state assemblyman even contacted me about testifying in support of proposed legislation that would require HOAs to follow stricter due process procedures before fining homeowners. I agreed and spent a surreal day in Sacramento at the state capitol, telling my story to a legislative committee. The bill eventually passed, creating new requirements for HOA enforcement procedures throughout California. It mandated written notice with photographic evidence before any fine could be issued, a formal appeal process with specific timelines, and penalties for HOAs that engaged in discriminatory or retaliatory enforcement. It wasn't just because of my testimony, of course. Plenty of other homeowners had horror stories, and the issue had been building for years. But I'd played a small part in creating positive change that would help thousands of homeowners across the state. Looking back on everything now, more than a year after that first confrontation with Patricia, I'm struck by how much changed because I refused to just accept an unfair fine. It would have been easier to pay the money, screen the propane tank, and avoid conflict. That's what most people do, and I don't blame them. Legal battles are expensive and stressful, but sometimes taking the easy path just enables broken systems to continue breaking. Someone has to push back. Someone has to say this isn't right and be willing to follow through. My propane tank, of all things, became the catalyst for reforming an HOA board, implementing better governance procedures, and eventually contributing to statewide legislative reform. All because I owned the tank that supplied the clubhouse and was willing to use that leverage. Property rights matter. Fair treatment matters. Accountability matters. These days, I serve on the HOA Architectural Review Committee. It's volunteer work, reviewing applications from homeowners who want to make changes to their properties. I make sure we apply the rules consistently and fairly. When someone submits a request that's borderline, I advocate for approval rather than rejection. When we have to say no to something, I make sure we explain exactly why and suggest alternatives. The clubhouse still runs on propane from the tank on my property. The easement is still in place. But now, there's mutual respect underlying that arrangement. The HOA treats me fairly, and I don't interfere with their legitimate use of the easement. It's how things should have worked from the beginning. It just took a conflict, a near crisis, and a lot of stubbornness on both sides to get us there. Sometimes I walk past the clubhouse in the evening and see people inside, using the facilities, enjoying the community space. Kids taking swimming lessons in the pool, adults working out in the gym, community meetings in the conference room. All of it heated and powered by propane that flows from my property. It's a small thing, really. A tank and a pipeline and an easement agreement. But it's also a reminder that communities are built on interconnected rights and responsibilities. We all depend on each other, and we all deserve to be treated with respect. That's the real lesson of my HOA battle. Not that I was right and Patricia was wrong, though I believe that to be true. The real lesson is that strong communities require both rules and fairness, both authority and accountability. The propane still flows. The clubhouse still operates. The neighborhood still functions. But now it does so with better governance, clearer rules, and a board that remembers it serves the homeowners, not the other way around. and my property remains violation-free, with a nicely landscaped propane tank that meets the community's reasonable standards. Sometimes justice requires leverage. Sometimes fairness requires conflict. But in the end, everyone benefits when systems are forced to work the way they're supposed to work, transparently, consistently, and with respect for everyone involved. That's worth fighting for. Even if it means shutting off the propane to prove a point.